Welcome back. You're watching To The Point, and we're discussing the state of the economy as well as the critical question, why is private sector investment failing to pick up? Gentlemen, let's come to this issue of reforms. Mr. Bhattacharya, recently, both Moody's Investor Services and Standard & Poor expressed concern about the slowdown in the pace of reform. Now, although the government has done several reforms, and recently they've taken steps to make FDI easier in 15 areas, they've helped improve the ease of doing business, the RBI is considering making external commercial borrowing simpler. What are the sort of reforms that are failing to happen? Or are Moody's and Standard & Poor wrong in their criticism?
No, I don't think Moody's or Standard & Poor are wrong. I have a different definition of reforms. When you relax the FDI norms, these are changing the policy that are already existing and making them more attractive. For me, reforms are the kind of reforms that the government should attempt is what it said in the budget when Mr. Jaitley presented it in February 2015. He talked about strategic sale of PSUs in his budget. As a matter of fact, the 65,000 crore of disinvestment proceeds that he had budgeted for, out of that he had provided 22,000 crore of money coming from strategic sale of PSUs. 8 months are over, but not a single PSU has been put up for strategic sale. Strategic sale is a different name for a privatization. Now, that would be some kind of a reform that I would look for. When I'm talking about public sector banks are sitting on with 9 lakh crore of sticky assets. Now, you are blaming industry for not investing. Industry does not just require its own money to invest, it also needs the money from the banking sector to help them invest. Now, unless you clean up these banks with some reformist measures, which would include ownership changes or creating a holding company concept like the PG&I committee had recommended, you will not talk about reforms. So that is the second kind of reform that I would like to see. First is the strategic sale of PSUs. Second is the banking sector reforms by changing the ownership pattern. And the third is for the 11th month consecutively, we have seen exports falling. Now, what have we done with regard to our trade policy, our engagement with our trading partners, or are we looking at WTO negotiations in a different way and trying to plug in ourselves to the different trading arrangements blocks that are coming up across the world in different trading blocks? Now, I don't see any reformist moves in any of these 3 areas that I mentioned. Okay. Unless the government really commits itself to these 3 areas, at least, I would not say that the government is moving in the reformist direction.
There are some other reforms that people feel, Mr. Sheshasai, that this government has shied away from. For instance, reducing subsidies in kerosene and fertilizer. With the oil price down, this was perhaps an ideal time to do it. Another one is major administrative reforms in the tax area. Even the retrospective taxation that's haunting investors continues on the books. All that we have from the government is a promise not to do it. And when Mr. Modi went to London recently, he discovered that, in fact, that doesn't convince British investors entirely. Are there here steps the government should have taken, and is it missing an opportunity by not taking it quickly?
I think the government has has moved in the right direction. Including in the administrative reforms, in as much as the focus on ease of doing business has been there right from the beginning. But I must say that perhaps the results are slow in coming. So it's not so much for lack of efforts, but it is lack of commensurate output. We ought to make major changes in the administrative reform in order to move up the ladder in terms of ease of doing business, or to ensure that we land all the visionary missions in terms of actual ground level realities to avoid transmission losses. Okay. These require a very nimble-footed administrative machinery, and I think these clearly are the areas where we need more aggressive focus from the government going forward. I must say that the direction is right, but the pace can certainly change and improve.
Mr. Rajiv Kumar, I want to pick up on that point you heard from Mr. Bhattacharya about the government's attitude to trade and trade-related mega trade treaties. You wrote about this recently in the Times of India. You were very critical of the government's attitude to trade treaties such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. In simple layman's language, can you explain why the government's attitude to trade and trade deals is worrying you?
Karan, before I get on to the trade, just let me say two things. One, that Moody's and other credit rating agencies will do well to move away from their obsession with these two, GST and the land acquisition land bill, because our economy did grow at above 9% even when those reforms had not taken place and those laws had not been passed. Second, I've been looking in some great detail at the administrative measures that the government has taken, and I must confess that I find a lot of spade work has been done which will sustain growth over the longer and medium term period. Coming to the trade part, where I'm actually very worried, in straightforward terms, my worry is that if we don't take measures to improve our external demand, our external export performance, there will be growing pressure for protectionism in this country, some of which we are already beginning to see, because there is now demand for reviewing the free trade agreement that we've got, because our industries are facing facing inverted duty structures and negative incentives. So the fact remains that the external demand, net exports, continue to contribute in negative terms to our growth efforts. And what we are not doing is to have a thorough review of our export promotion measures, get away from this annual business of fiscal incentives and changing duty drawbacks rate from one to the other, and take a step towards improving the infrastructure capabilities of our exporters and putting them on a globally competitive framework. Because if we don't do that, we will be steadily excluded from major export markets. And that will be a pity, because we cannot grow only on the basis of domestic demand.
Mr. Chinoy, you've heard three very cogent responses to the question about reform. You've heard Mr. Bhattacharya say that you need major reforms which the government isn't tackling. What the government is doing instead is to simply improve the existing system. You've heard Mr. Sheshasai talk about the need for greater pace in terms of administrative reform, perhaps in the tax area in particular, and you've heard Mr. Kumar talk about the government needing to focus on trade and trade partnerships, where if they don't, our economy will not grow because exports won't grow. If Mr. Jaitley, against this background, were to ask you what are the 3 steps he needs to take, very quickly, what would they be?
Well, I think your question is poised correctly, because there's an unending list of reforms. The question is, political capital is finite, and where do you prioritize? I'm going to make the case that I don't hold out much hope on the external front. Remember, when India was growing at 9%, the world was growing at 4.5%. Exports were a driver of growth. That era has passed. We're going to see a period of global stagnation. So let's not worry too much about exports. The focus has to be domestic demand. I have one theme really: infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. I can't overemphasize the productivity gains that you can get if we can build out the kind of infrastructure that China built over 20 years. For me, that means 3 things. It means, A, do some form of land acquisition, if not now, in the next 3 or 4 years, and make that easier. The second is, although this is a state subject, I think power becomes crucial to competitiveness and infrastructure, and the government has to goad states to try and solve the distribution problem with power. And the third comes to banking and leverage, because one of the problems we haven't seen much infrastructure investment in the private sector is you've got highly levered balance sheets, and we've got to find a way to delever that as soon as possible. So for me, the focus is going to be on infrastructure, because the externalities from that to the economy, to the broader economy, are incalculable.
Mr. Bhattacharya, when you heard Sajid Chinoy talk about infrastructure, 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 I presume that was music to your ears, because he was in a sense echoing what you wrote in your leader today. You say, and I'm quoting your leader, The government certainly can do a lot to accelerate infrastructure investment. And you add that on this rests the prospects of a revival in private investment and therefore an acceleration in growth. What do you believe are the steps the government needs to take to accelerate infrastructure investment?
Well, I would expect the budget to provide adequate investment stimulus for infrastructure sector, and not the kind of investment stimulus that we saw in the last budget, which actually was only an increase of 30,000 crore on the capex side. I think now that the economy is in dire need of a substantial investment stimulus, which can actually help either in the public sector, or it will help invite the private sector to be in partnership with the public sector to creating infrastructure and making it stronger and helping, as Sajid said, improve the efficiency gains in the private sector.
Rajiv Kumar, I want to end this show by asking you a very different question, and I'm doing it deliberately. We've spent all our time talking about where the economy's performance could be better, where it's weak. We've talked about what the government isn't doing and what it needs to do. And that often leaves audiences with a rather perplexed, sometimes even negative impression of the state of affairs. So my very different question to you, which I'll end with, is after 18 months of Modi as Prime Minister and Jaitley as Finance Minister, what is your assessment of their handling of the economy over this 1.5-year period?
Oh, I'll give them reasonably high marks on handling of the economy, especially because of what Sajid said, which is that today India is no longer in the member of the Fragile Five. It's a beacon of stability in an emerging economy scenario, which is actually quite turbulent and quite quite troublesome, and therefore full marks to the team for achieving that, and I think also for getting the green shoots of recovery in place. But I think it's also my job to point out that there is a long road ahead, and their focus on growth impetus from both the government and the RBI, and the two must work in unison at this point of time, is an absolute necessity. And for that, the investment in agriculture and in public housing, I think, are the two which will give us quick returns and not have long gestation periods as the investment projects might have.
Mr. Shesasai, as chairman of Infosys, one of the country's biggest and most highly regarded companies, do you accept that verdict? And you have to give me an answer in just 30 seconds, sir. Rajiv Kumar says the government has done well, but he also says to the government there's a long and arduous road ahead, and they need to walk down that road with accelerated pace. Do you agree with that verdict? Quickly in 30 seconds.
I agree with that.
That was much faster an answer than I thought I was going to get. I thank you for being sharp and to the point. You agree with that. The government's done a good job, but it's got a big job still to do, and it needs to do it with dedication. My thanks to all my guests for joining me, and if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.
It's the crucial climate summit in Paris, 2 weeks after a deadly terror attack. The focus is to save the environment. India has major initiatives, but in this, Prime Minister